name is Jamey Sturgill, and I'm youth minister here at St. Anne's Catholic Church. A couple of weeks ago, Father Clevens and I met, and I asked if I could start a philosophy class here at St. Anne's, and he said sure. Since then, we have not been able to have any meetings, but I thought, why not try to do it live or record it and post it? I myself am a convert, and I generally like to say I became Thomist before I became Catholic. I was attending a Catholic church in Virginia for several weeks, and they asked me who my sponsor was, and I said St. Thomas Aquinas. Part of that conversion story comes back to when I was teaching in South Korea, and I had some very brilliant students who had some very deep and wonderful questions. And it seemed like every time that I went to find an answer or to attempt to answer their questions, I found myself reading the Summa. And Aquinas was very good at attempting to answer life's biggest questions. And not only was Aquinas good at attempting to answer life's biggest questions, he was also good at giving the alternative answers. I'm sure as a regular person, we all have experienced being misrepresented or someone saying that you believe something that you don't believe. Well, one of the great things about St. Thomas Aquinas was he generally gave his opponent's argument in better and more precise words than they gave it themselves. That is a wonderful characteristic to have, especially for a philosopher. And when you go to the Summa, you can't help but walk away with respect for him, at least in those categories. I remember I was taking a philosophy class online with a Reformed theologian, and he said, St. Thomas Aquinas is wrong about most things, but he tempts you to think that he's right by the mere fact that he covers so much. And I think part of that's true. You know, he says so much about even his opponent that it tempts you to believe that what he's saying is true. But he's also very sound in his reasoning.
We all ask questions about life. Who are we? Who is God? What is wisdom, and how do we pursue it? And the world can seem chaotic, full of uncertainty and mystery. In a sea of conflicting voices and opinions, it can be hard to chart a course. We need a navigator, someone who can point us toward true north and guide us along the way. In this endeavor, many who have gone before us have looked to St. Thomas Aquinas. But why? Aquinas is widely regarded as one of the world's greatest philosophers and theologians, and he has proven to be one of history's finest teachers. Perhaps better than anyone before or since, he harmonized the riches of scripture and tradition with the wisdom of antiquity. If you're just starting out at learning Aquinas, or if you're just encountering the Thomistic tradition, it can seem intimidating. But don't worry, it's not as hard as you think. In fact, once you get the hang of it, Aquinas' thought sheds light on some of the most important questions. You will even find that he has become your friend and a trusted guide in the ways of wisdom. The Thomistic Institute is here to help you make sense of his teaching and to follow him on his own terms, and in the process, to come to know more deeply the great Catholic and Christian intellectual tradition. Welcome to Aquinas 101. Aquinas 101 offers a series of videos designed to help you engage with the truth as Aquinas presents it. We'll break down who St. Thomas is, his works, and his vocabulary, and we'll do a careful walkthrough of the Summa Theologiae. Over the course of these videos, you'll learn about topics ranging from creation to the last things, all with an eye towards God who gives light to our minds. So sign up for a video course, and let's get started.
Yeah. So after the first video there, one of the things that we hear Father Gregory Pine saying is that St. Thomas Aquinas can be our guide. Now, a guide isn't someone who tells you exactly what things are. As a matter of fact, one author that I read often says, "I will point things out to you as we go." And that's a good way to think of a guide. And when I think of Thomism, I do not think of a list of beliefs. It's not really a creed, it's more of a mentality. And one of the precise things that this mentality is, Father Gregory Pine also covers, and that is that it is a synthesis. And a synthesis means that you are combining different things. And the two things that St. Thomas is so good at combining is antiquity and faith and tradition and scripture. But really we could just say faith and reason. So St. Thomas is taking the Greek philosophers, Aristotle, who he refers to as the philosopher, which I'm sure either Father Gregory Pine or Father Thomas Joseph White will get into later, and as well as some of the Stoics. Aquinas quotes from the Stoics. He quotes from St. Augustine more than anybody else, which St. Augustine, by most philosophers at least, is considered a Platonist. So we hear many people quoted from St. Thomas, but he's also always bringing in scripture. And he does a marvelous job of combining all of them and pulling out wisdom from them all. So that is precisely what makes St. Thomas a superior teacher, I believe. And it's just one of those things that this isn't, you should believe St. Thomas because he's a great synthesizer. You already do this. I mean, even right now during this time of the coronavirus, if you were to only reference one news channel, you're probably going to fall short of what's going on. And one of the things that we like to do is we watch numerous news channels, right? Or, I mean, even if someone says that something happened, you talk to the other people who were there. I have 3 children. Someone's crying. Rather than just ask the person who's crying what happened, I ask all 3 children what's happened. And this is in essence what a synthesis does. And this is in essence what St. Thomas Aquinas does. Is he's not just asking what happened according to the book or what happened according to the philosopher, but he's saying if the philosopher is getting at the truth and the book is getting at the truth, then we will find a synthesis, a harmony amongst them in the middle, and maybe not even in the middle, maybe in the middle is the wrong way to explain it, but we'll find a complementarity in this combination or in this synthesis. And that is the essence of what St. Thomas's philosophy is about. And that is in essence what Father Gregory Pine is saying makes St. Thomas a great teacher. In addition, at the end of this talk, Father Gregory Pine explains that this is the Catholic intellectual tradition. And as I said earlier, as an evangelical, it also happened to be my intellectual tradition. There's not nearly as many folks who have answered the things that St. Thomas has answered. So many evangelicals also reference St. Thomas Aquinas. And in addition to that, I would like to say that this does not mean that a philosophy is the whole of Christianity. This is the intellectual tradition, and this is not at the exclusion of the practice. It is not at the exclusion of spirituality. It's not at the exclusion of physicality, but this is the intellectual tradition. And just because you can't say everything about everything all the time doesn't mean that there are things that aren't true in what is being said. So this is a very specific attempt to explain the intellectual tradition of the Catholic Church. And it is very secure to say that it is the intellectual tradition of the Catholic Church. There have been numerous examples of encyclicals speaking of the specificity of St. Thomas Aquinas' philosophy, as a secure and good foundation for the Catholic belief. And let's see, Aeterni Patre from Pope Leo XIII, and then after Pope Leo XIII, Pope Pius X even gave out 21 principles, or 24 Thomistic theses as principles by which Catholics can find a secure philosophy in. And then going with the famous document from Pope John Paul, Fide et Ratio, we get an explanation of Christian philosophy as essentially a very specific form of Thomism, which deals with some of the principles that we'll be covering in this philosophy class. I think there are 20 plus so far, and one just came out today of Aquinas 101, so we could do this for a long time, but at least to get introduced and begin it is what we'll be doing here. So let's look at the second video.
St. Thomas Aquinas was born circa 1225 in the region around Naples. He was born to an influential family, one of the youngest of some 9 children. At the age of 5, he went to live and study at the nearby Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino. Then, at the age of 16, he enrolled in the University of Naples to pursue a course of liberal arts. There, he met a recently founded religious community, the Order of Preachers, or Dominicans, and he resolved to join their ranks. After overcoming his family's objections to his entry, they had plans for him to become an influential abbot, St. Thomas took the friar's habit and continued to pursue his studies in Paris and Cologne for another 11 years. He actually spent part of that time as a student of St. Albert the Great, another leading light of the Middle Ages. In 1256, St. Thomas was fully accredited as a theologian and began his career as a teacher. He served in a variety of European universities, in the papal curia, and in the convents of his own order. So he spent time in Cologne, in Naples, in Orvieto, in Rome, and in Paris. St. Thomas's holiness is hidden but beautiful. When grappling with vexing theological questions about the Eucharist, he was known to rest his head on the tabernacle in supplication. On another occasion, the Lord appeared to him to commend him for his work, saying, "Well you have written of me, Thomas. What would you have in return?" St. Thomas is said to have responded, "Nothing but thyself, O Lord. Nothing but thyself." St. Thomas labored generously throughout his life, but his days ended in a peculiar silence. On December 6, 1273, he had a mystical experience that led him to set down his pens. When asked why, he responded, "Compared to what I have seen, everything I have written is as so much straw." St. Thomas died on March 7, 1274, while on a journey in service of the Universal Church. He was canonized in 1323 in recognition of his life of great learning and sanctity. St. Thomas is especially well known and remembered for the wisdom which he demonstrated in his philosophical and theological works. His intellectual legacy has enriched the Church almost beyond compare. St. Thomas is also remembered for purity and chastity, which he possessed to perfection. He is said to have preserved a kind of cherubic innocence throughout his life. St. Thomas is regarded as the common doctor of the Church, a safe and sure guide, as one who gives most eloquent expression to the Church's faith and teaching. For readings, podcasts, and more videos like this, go to Aquinas101.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for one of our free video courses on Aquinas. And don't forget to like and share with your friends, because it matters what you think.
So one of the things in the second video that I find enlightening or good to think about is towards the end of St. Thomas's life, when he did have the mystical experience and he said that all was straw. And going back to the explanation of the intellectual tradition, this is the intellectual tradition. This is not the only aspect of our faith. And it would be a misrepresentation, a poor misrepresentation, to say that St. Thomas Aquinas was merely an intellectual. And I think it would be to be a poor student of St. Thomas Aquinas if you were to only be an intellectual and to only think about your faith. And for myself, this is one of the things that I worry about, I could say. And I like to think of it in these terms of once the theologian died, and when he died, they asked him if he would like to go to heaven or if he would like to go to a lecture on heaven. And the theologian chose the lecture. St. Thomas Aquinas, I think, would be very upset with that theologian. Maybe I should say very sad. And I too would be very upset with myself had I chosen, or if I were to choose, to go to the lecture on heaven rather than heaven. And I think this is important again to discuss that the reality of the intellectual tradition of the faith is not the only part of our faith, but it is a vital part of our faith. Our intellect is one of the precise things that distinguishes us from the animals. And of all the faiths in the world, of all the Christian denominations, we have an intellectual tradition to be proud of, an intellectual tradition that has not been afraid to look at what others have to say. And Aquinas is, again, wonderful precisely for that reason of being able to entertain other ideas and even find truth in other ideas. And I also enjoy the part where he is writing on the Eucharist, and he was known to lay his head down on the tabernacle, I think he said. There we find the intellectual tradition with the physicality of our faith, as well as with the practice and the essence of prayer that our faith should have. Again, St. Thomas is a great intellectual teacher, but he is not merely an intellect. And from reading him, you should not merely become an intellect. From understanding his philosophy, you should not merely be an intellectual person, but an attempt to be a better believer. So that's what we're essentially after. But anyway, so St. Thomas Aquinas is very good at showing us the reality of our faith, not just the intellectual side of our faith. Another thing that he says in the video is about St. Thomas Aquinas' chastity and purity and his cherubic-like innocence, Father Gregory Pine says. And I have heard the story that when he went to confession one time with Brother Reginald, it was his name, who was his confessor. Brother Reginald came out of the confessional and said, "The sins of a child." And us as Catholics, there is a old classical intellectual tradition that says sanctity and sanity go together. It is a very poor modern bifurcation, a very poor modern distinction when we say a man's intelligence or a man's understanding of what is right does not correlate with how he acts. And the great example of this is the addict. It's very difficult to trust an addict because they're generally trying to get what it is that they're addicted to. And just as it is with the addict of drugs, so it is with the addict of sin. And this is one of the reasons that it's important to talk about and think about St. Thomas Aquinas' cherubic innocence, as Father Gregory Pine says, because sanctity and sanity do go together. A man who is less addicted has a clearer vision, and not only because of these reasons, but because our blessed Lord himself said so when he said, "If you obey the commandments, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." In other words, people who are addicted to sin have a difficult time in seeing the truth. And St. Thomas Aquinas confessed the sins of a child. That's relevant.